Jeff graduated from UCLA with a 3.85 GPA and a 514 MCAT. Jeff published in Nature Communications and has multiple leadership opportunities, and yet he barely got into medical school. For the first time, I'll review his real AMCAS application, the same one that 30 plus medical schools passed on. And together, we'll reveal the 5 key takeaways that can help you get into your dream medical school. At the end, I'll tell you where he was accepted, and if you have similar stats or a similar application, pay close attention, because while getting into medical school is possible with this application, you'll want to have an excellent written application. Okay, let's take a look at his GPA, 3.85 cumulative with a pretty consistent spread over the years and a 514 on the MCAT with a 131, 128, 128, 127, pretty balanced spread overall. And we start with the stats because it contextualizes the pre-med's starting chances. And these are pretty good stats, all things considered. Coming from a school like UCLA, competitive public school, I think he's in a good place stat-wise to give himself a good chance to get into medical school. So let's scroll down and start with the 5 key takeaways. Takeaway number 1, the right message, but the wrong messenger. The main idea here is that conclusions and reflections must be backed up, and it must be substantiated by the appropriate level of story or lived experiences. Everyone can say medicine is a profession for people. It's a profession where you combine science and empathy, but you need the right stories and you need the right data and impact to prove that you understand that message. Otherwise, what happens is you give this conclusion with no real evidence to support it, and you sound like you're out of touch with reality. There's a couple of examples in this application that I think make this core mistake, and we'll go to those now. All right, so let's go ahead and hop into our first work and activity here. And this is, we start off with the Nature publication. I'm a co-author in our paper, which details the complex structure and mechanisms of rotavirus. My major contributions include modeling of the polymerase and the capsid proteins and the quality of multiple ambiguous regions of consequence, making telling figures and movies of these structures, and I edited the manuscript. This was an enlightening experience that allowed me to work with several veteran experts, and through the hours of literature review, countless revisions, and late nights in the lab, I've come to affirm that diligence is required for any worthwhile project or investment. And you'll see here that I highlight things intentionally, in green, in blue, and in red. In green, you'll have your responsibilities, aka what is the student doing? In blue, you'll have the responsibilities, aka what is the student doing? In green, you'll have the impact, which can be dictated by stories or by data. And then in red are the reflections. Why does this matter and how have you grown as a person? And the goal kind of breakdown of the blues, greens, and reds, or you want 20% responsibilities, 40% stories, impact, data, and 40% reflections. Why does it matter? How have you grown? And we call that here at PREMED Catalyst the 20-40-40 RIR framework. It's just a good starting place to make sure that you're focusing on the impact and the reflections and not the responsibilities. I'll give you an example here of how you get a ton of blue, which is a ton of responsibilities here, and how this description falls very flat. But for now, let's go back to our first experience here. We've read it together, and you can see that it's just like, okay, right? These are the responsibilities in blue. There's some story about how he's in charge of the rotavirus and the polymerase, and the reflection falls flat, right? Through the hours of literature review and countless revisions and the late nights in the lab, I've come to affirm that diligence is required for any worthwhile project or investment. At the end of it, I go, okay, now what? Or next, let's go on to the next work and activities, which you don't want, right? You want your writing to be memorable. You want it to really capture what you're interested in, who you are, and this doesn't fully do that for me. And to be clear here, that's okay, right? Not all 15 of your work and activities are going to hit it out of the park, be a home run. But I will say that there is some room for improvement in this activity. Specifically, that the impact and the stories and the data are weak, right? We don't really know much more about the experience. And then the reflection is also weak. It basically just says, in order for you to do good work, you must work hard. Okay, fine, next. Now we move on to this microbiology lab assistant. As an assistant in an intro lab, I sought to help students master fundamental lab techniques. These included procedures. I grew bacterial colonies, I conducted various tests and assays, I explained concepts, I performed detailed demonstrations so students could fully understand the material and replicate the desired results. I also attended meetings with the instructional staff to review learning objectives, and I reflected upon the previous week and identified areas for improvement. Having once struggled with bench work myself, now we're getting into reflection, right? Reflection in red. I relished being able to use my resources to aid others in the same position. This is a classic example of an 80% responsibilities entry. You can see the entire time you're just telling me what you do. You help students, you do grow colonies, you conduct tests, you explain concepts, you attend meetings, and you reflect upon the previous week. All of it is what you do. And if I asked you, for example, hey, what do you think a microbiology lab assistant does? You would probably say these things. Oh, I think they probably help with the lab and grade some papers and teach students on how to do things, right? And so if you already know, based on just this title, it's probably not worth your time as a pre-med to write 4 sentences, 5 lines worth of repeating what you do as a laboratory assistant. I see this mistake all the time. Right? If you're a lab assistant, a scribe, an EMT, a hospital volunteer, a hospice volunteer, we all know what you do. So you don't need to continue to reiterate and repeat that because it's not new. If you're a medical assistant at a cardiology office, I know what you do. You do the EKGs, you intake patients, you call patients for their appointment, you run the insurance, you translate if you speak a different language. I know what you do, right? And so when your entire entry is just pure responsibilities, that hurts your writing. Because as you could see when we read this together, you were bored, I was bored, the admissions committee is going to be bored when they're reading this. And at the end, we get this kind of measly reflection. Having once struggled with bench work myself, I relish being able to use my resources to aid others in the same position. Okay, fine, right? Next. And this is not what you want the reading experience to be. You don't want it to be, okay, next, because at the end of 15 of these experiences, you'll be bored and you'll be done and you won't remember this applicant. All right, let's go ahead and move to the next working activities. Here we have a poster presentation. Okay, we got a poster presentation. BLANK is a national undergraduate program that pushes for the discovery of novel bacteriophages. After isolating the novel phage AJ, my team performed several experimental wet lab procedures with AJ and annotated its genome, which has been deposited in the public database, Phages database. Our experiments examined the effects of decreasing pH and increasing temperature applications on AJ's virulence. So you can see in green here, this is the story of AJ, which culminated in a poster presentation. Throughout this project, I developed strong interpersonal skills within a team dynamic as our group had to communicate effectively, distribute responsibilities, and cooperatively address competing ideas and interests. Okay, so we get this reflection at the end. There's a real name of a real bacteriophage, AJ. There's something that we can all kind of relate to. The project was about how pH and temperature affect this virulence. So it feels just more relatable than the other 2 experiences, right? Like we know exactly what he's doing, why he's doing it. And even though it's not like curing cancer, which it doesn't have to be, it is very clear that this project has its scope. He's operating within the scope and he's doing a good job. This whole reflection about working in a team, communicating effectively, okay, fine, maybe, right? The story doesn't really focus on that. And so to me, it's kind of like a good, not great type of conclusion. All right, and now we get our first most meaningful experience here, the site director and community outreach director for a club that is in charge of helping younger students with literacy and English and schoolwork. As a site director for BLANK, I was in charge of driving a dozen tutors to site, pairing them with the learners, and maintaining open communication with our community partners. I also oversaw the weekly creation of a specific level of curriculum to introduce important themes outside of English. As community outreach director, I acted as a liaison between our club and our other campus organizations. I planned, I coordinated for various sites. My responsibilities has imparted certain wisdoms on how to better motivate and lead. These endeavors have also made me more confident in taking initiative in other areas of my life. So I didn't highlight this, but I wrote it here that all of this is blue. It's just responsibilities, right? Driving, pairing, maintaining, overseeing, acting as a liaison, planning, coordinating. It's just like what he's doing. Okay, fine. Responsibilities. I would say it's probably more than I would have liked. I would have just cut it down to 2 sentences maybe, because all this stuff is just like, all right, whatever, fine. He is doing all the club logistic stuff. We get to the reflection here in red, and it talks about how he has become a better motivator and a leader from this, and he's also become more confident. Really, when you read these responsibilities, you don't really get a sense of that, right? He's driving tutors to site, he's pairing them with learners, he's making a curriculum. I don't really see a real story that is relatable and helps me truly understand that he's a better leader from it. And so I wrote here, it's hard to appreciate the reflections without stories and data. So let's look at this most meaningful remark here. I decided to make the transition from tutor to board member because I wanted to make a bigger contribution in a leadership role, one that allowed me to address some of the deficiencies I personally identified in the program. So it sounds very fancy, but I want you guys to pause and think about what this sentence means. This sentence means I went from general member to board member because I wanted to do more. And leaders do more, right? I wanted to be a leader to address some of the weaknesses in the program. Isn't that true of anyone that starts as a volunteer and then becomes a leader? In short, what I'm saying is that I don't think this is very necessary or telling. You became a leader so that you could do something in the club that you weren't doing as just a general member. And so using these 2 sentences doesn't really tell me anything. This included unproductivity and the lack of an interactive element in the curriculum. I think I'm always cautious about sentences like these because they almost feel critical, like the club was not good enough and I'm really trying to close down these gaps. And it's totally fine to look for opportunities to improve them, but this almost just seemed a little too critical for me. As site director, my mindset and demeanor had a profound effect on our tutors. Rather than monitoring groups to stay on task, I found it more effective to set the standard myself. My attitude was contagious and prompted the rest of our team to be more accountable. I think this is fine, but you noticed in the way that I was saying it, when I started reading these sentences, it almost felt, I wrote here, like self-referential. There's almost like a lack of tact here. It doesn't sound, it's certainly humble is not the first word I would use to describe this, right? Where it was that the club was unproductive. I had to step into a leadership role. It was my mindset and my demeanor that had a profound effect on tutors. It was just like my leadership. Rather than monitoring groups to stay on task, I was setting the standard myself, and I'm contagious, and I prompted the rest of our team to be more accountable. And while I believe you, it just seems a little full of yourself, right? And the role of a partner in helping you with your written application. Our role here is to read and tell you exactly how we're feeling. If we're feeling excited and we want you to tell me more about that, we'll tell you. If you are boring us and we don't actually need to read that sentence, like this first one, we'll tell you so that you can delete the sentence or replace it. And if I feel like you're feeling a little bit not humble, a little bit self-referential, I will tell you, because I don't want admissions committees to feel the same way that I am feeling when I read your piece. And so this is why writing is a team sport. I'm sure as the writer, he never meant to sound humble. I mean, he never meant to sound not humble and self-referential. He was just kind of telling his truth and his perspective. And I know this guy personally, he's not a guy that's full of himself. He's not a guy that wants to just put it in your face and say that I'm better than you. He's not that guy, but you can see that in this writing, it comes across that way. So big takeaway here is writing is a team sport. Make sure that other people read it and tell you exactly what they are feeling, when they are feeling, so you can make the appropriate adjustments. As community outreach director, I saw a unique opportunity to simultaneously address what I perceived to be a repetitive weekly agenda and instill my passion for science and medicine in the kids. Again, it really does feel a little self-referential, right? It feels like everything is about you, the author of this pre-med. It almost is like forcing down the throat of the AdCom, hey, look, I'm special. I'm doing a lot of this work. I have a unique opportunity. I'm setting the standard. My attitude is contagious, and I make my entire team accountable. it almost feels like you're trying too hard here. And it's when you are trying too hard to stand out, it almost leads to the opposite, where you feel self-referential, you're not humble, and you almost like leave a bad taste in the viewer's mouth. The best leaders, from my perspective and from my experience, are not the ones who say that I am setting the standard and I am contagious and follow my lead. That's kind of the most vocal person, but it's not necessarily the best leader. I think the best leaders are the opposite. They listen, they're patient, they're quiet, they observe, they remove obstacles from other people so that they can excel. This doesn't feel like that, right? Okay, and then he arranges for other parties to visit the sites and the CPR students and taught CPR, and he learns valuable lessons about being a responsible role model and the importance of preparation. It was incredibly rewarding to set an ambitious goal, commit the necessary effort, and ultimately see my visions. Again, kind of this phrasing, right? That's self-referential, for the club realized. And so I think some editors would read this last sentence and feel like, oh, the conclusion is off, and they'll change the conclusion. But I disagree with that. I think this conclusion is fine, right? For other people, you can write the exact same conclusion, but the problem is, and the difference is, everything before the conclusion has kind of rubbed me the wrong way, right? It's like not humble, it's self-referential, and at the end, it kind of reinforces this, like everything was my vision for my club, right? And so if you're writing, one tip for you is asking yourself the question, is the problem with this sentence, or is the problem with the sentences before, right? Is it the evidence that leads to the conclusion, or is it the conclusion itself? In this scenario, I think it's really this, right? This bulk of the writing that just puts me off on the wrong page. It doesn't really build a great relationship or rapport with the reader. That is the problem, in my opinion, not the last sentence here. Okay, now let's move on to this next experience, a camp counselor. So for this camp counselor experience, I want you to just focus on this highlight and grade here. By sharing advice regarding high school and college, I was able to assuage many of their uncertainties about the future and encourage them to pursue post-secondary education. And here, it's a small thing, but really, I have not heard, I don't remember the last time someone told me or used assuage in a sentence out loud. And when you start using words that people don't really use in everyday conversation, like instead of calling this college, you call it post-secondary education or assuage, it kind of gets in the way of reading the experience, right? I'm like more focused on, wait, what does that word mean again? And how do I pronounce it? And I should be focused on what you're actually writing and the story that you're trying to tell me. And so one of the huge mistakes that a lot of pre-meds make is that they think that higher vocabulary and higher grade level writing is impressive, but really it's just distracting. And this is just the first example of many examples in the coming extracurriculars that I want to highlight. So I'm going to move on to this next one here, the cryo-EM research. Working in a cryo-electron microscopy lab, I practice fundamental techniques, sample optimization, preparation, imaging, and data processing. The lab's goals focus on utilizing these methods to investigate viruses and other nano machines for prospective medical applications. Like what is my question here? After sample imaging and data reconstruction, I would build and refine proteins and particles with molecular modeling software. And then I would evaluate them to elucidate the potential mechanisms of function. Exceptional models would be put on this database. So again, I'm trying to understand, I'm trying to be open-minded about this cryo-electron microscopy lab. But I write here that sometimes it can feel so foreign and disconnected from clinical medicine, right? It's just, I know that it's nanomachines that's supposed to help with medical applications, but I don't know what applications. I don't really know what these nanomachines and these viruses do. So it just really begs the question for me, like, why did you join a cryo-EM lab? And this is helpful for all pre-meds, right? Like, look at your extracurriculars, and would anyone ask, oh, why are you in XYZ, right? And if you have a good reason, like, hey, Mike, why did you coach youth basketball? It's because, I started playing basketball at that Parks and Rec. I really love teaching and mentorship, and coaching youth basketball seemed like a great way to combine my childhood, my favorite sport, and my passions for teaching and youth mentorship, right? That's a great reason. But then you get to this and it's like, why did you join a cryo-electron microscopy lab? And I would like for him to explain it. But immediately my question is like, what is all this about? Moving on here, my first week, I remember thinking how distinct the lab environment felt from the classroom setting. It was a momentous occasion when I loaded my first sample and made out the familiar outlines of bacteriophages, figures that I had only seen on textbooks. Immediately, this addition of a story, this is the first time where I'm like fluidly reading, right? I'm not skipping forward, really enjoying kind of the imagery of a little like capsid protein with the like 6 little legs that we've all seen on our textbooks, right? It quickly became evident that conducting research was drastically different from studying for tests. I found that success in the lab was predicated on critical thinking, as I had to consult literature to analyze and contextualize my results. Like, see, we're starting to really get some flow here. In addition to persistence, I also learned the value of working efficiently. For example, I would look for and identify symmetry in proteins so that the regions I fixed would propagate through the whole model, saving me precious time. And it's interesting, right? You get the little capsid and the 6 legs, and maybe this 20% is mirrored on the other side. And so you're starting to really see, oh, that's like a mirrored segment. And you can see him in the lab kind of working on this. I've come to respect the dedication and time that researchers must invest into the scientific method. And that conclusion is generic, right? It's abstract. But because this story is so clear, I believe this conclusion. It's not the conclusion's fault. It's never the reflection's fault. It is the evidence preceding the reflection that people mess up. The process is arduous as we have encountered problems and unexpected setbacks along the way. My first question is, like what? What setbacks and what did you do about them? But he doesn't answer the question. Yet it is also gratifying. It is also so gratifying as overcoming these obstacles ultimately made for a more fulfilling achievement in the end, right? So he just, again, talks about these obstacles that he doesn't really outline or specify. And I'm just sitting here like, okay, like what obstacle and what did you do? But instead, all I get is, oh, it was so satisfying fixing the obstacles. All right, fine. My work has made me realize bioinformatics research is a necessary driving force for the continual development of medical treatments and therapies. Again, the problem is not this conclusion. It's that he talks about symmetry and models, but he never once told me how his virus and his nanomachine is actually relevant for medical treatments and therapies. I don't have a single example of how a nanoparticle can deliver an antibiotic to a biofilm in the knee, right? It's like, that's a specific example that I can really understand, but there's no specific example here. And so the conclusion, again, it's fine. The conclusion is fine, but there's no supporting evidence. And so I'm reading here and I'm like, okay, this falls flat. These types of intellectual discoveries are something I look forward to pursuing as a future position. And if you're wondering like, oh, Mike, how do I use all these, put all these stories in? I don't have any space or room. And it's like, yes, you do. Like, this sentence is not necessary. These types of intellectual discoveries are something I look forward to pursuing as a future position. That literally tells me nothing, right? I don't need to know that. I need to know the story and I need to know why your work actually matters. And so I wrote here, I just wish the reader could feel that way about bioinformatics research. Like, I wanted to feel like it was important, but I can't because I don't have enough context. I don't know about the real example, the real project that you worked on. And so it's kind of a shame, right? We had an opportunity here to really convince the reader and we missed it. Okay, moving on to this next learning assistant position here. Let's go ahead. As an assistant for a genetics class, I fostered teamwork and asked leading questions to facilitate. Actually, before all this, let's reverse, and I'll start back up here. Okay, let's go ahead and go to this learning assistant position. And before we read a single thing, I just want you guys to focus on the words learning assistant for life sciences. What do you think this person does? He probably leads a classroom of undergrads taking molecular biology or cell biology or genetics or something. And he probably helps them with the worksheets. He asks the right questions. He helps students understand the concepts. That's probably what he does, right? And again, you don't need to read the description. You can read this, learning assistant, and you'll know exactly, roughly, what the person does. It's a teaching assistant, tutoring position. So let's see, given the fact that we already know that, let's see if he spends a lot of time just explaining that. As an assistant for a genetics class, first of all, like, not necessary, right? I foster teamwork and ask leading questions to facilitate learning. Exactly. I mean, I already told you. We already knew this, right? He probably asked questions for the class. I also formulated my own lesson plan, just like we said, makes worksheets, goes through them to supplement the coursework, and offered additional help during office hours, holds his own office hours, right? So all of this is just not necessary. And you have 2 sentences of space now because you decided, hey, like I can shorten that sentence, or hey, like I don't need that sentence at all. Teaching requires competence, tenacity, and creativity. So this I feel like is a little bit of an overextension, right? Does the making the lessons plans and offering office hours, does that feel like tenacious to you? Does that feel creative to you? Not really. There's not really a specific example there. So the reflection again it's a good reflection, but it doesn't hit home because there's no example of creativity. There's no example of tenacity, right? I don't think about lesson plans as being tenacious. I recall one art student who struggled with a certain genetics topic. I wish that we had a specific example. After asking her to draw a map of the chromosomes, she was better able to understand the problem. The conclusion here is by personalizing concepts and that teaching is tenacious and creative. Like, do you think that having an art student draw the chromosomes of a certain unknown genetics topic, is that an example of personalizing the concepts? Like, I'm guessing because she drew and she's an art student, that's like personalizing it. And if you were a chemistry major, you wouldn't have them draw the chromosomes. Like, the example just doesn't really make sense to me. And so the reflection and the working activity experience just like falls flat overall, right? These qualities are integral in my ability to help confuse and discourage students. So again, a great reflection, but I don't think just asking an art student to draw is really a good example of you helping a confused student, right? And so in this case, the issue is that we spent too much time with the responsibilities and our story is extremely weak and we have a bunch of empty promises as reflections, essentially. I think it's a little bit of an overextension to call teaching tenacious. And this kind of proves the point, or this leads to the point that you don't have to swing and go for a home run for every work and activity. If the learning assistant position was simple, keep it simple, write a simple experience, and give a simple story, and then keep your reflections like measured, keep them level. Don't swing for the fences for tenacity and things like that, because it just doesn't really fit the rest of the description. Okay, now we're going to move on to this next work and activities is physician shadowing. Small point here, but you're starting to see how if you are an admissions committee member reading more and more extracurriculars and they're back to back, you start to bring your perspective from the previous extracurriculars into the future extracurriculars that you're reading. So remember, we had a couple of work and activities where we were like, oh, that doesn't really feel humble. It's a little bit self-referential. And you bring that bias with you as you move on. So it's very important to make sure that we're not digging ourselves into that hole. And that we're actually the opposite, where we start with these extracurriculars that are like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. Thank you for sharing. You are such an impactful pre-med doing great work, because that like halo effect will propagate forward as well. So I introduced that concept because take a look at this here. Shadowing a seasoned internist, I was able to observe how a doctor should carry himself and handle patients. And by itself, that sentence is fine. But in the context of like the self-humility and the self-referential stuff earlier, it feels a little off-putting. It assumes that like a doctor has a standard and a doctor should carry himself and should handle patients a certain way. It almost feels like, doctors are kind of above society, and yes, they have different responsibilities and they have huge responsibilities to take care of patients. But I don't know, there's something about that should that just didn't rub me the right way. As I assisted with other tasks around the office, I learned that a physician must balance administrative duties in addition to clinical work. I shadowed a pediatrician, further explore my interest in pediatrics. Like, look at this sentence. I also shadowed pediatrician Dr. Blank, which has allowed me to further explore my interest in pediatrics. I would assume that if you are shadowing a pediatrician, that it would allow you to figure out if pediatrics is for you. And I'm not giggling or laughing at this person, but I'm just saying that these are like real applications that are being submitted every single year, and we can fix these things so that you can really put your best self on paper. And I want you to put your best self on paper. This is like one of my closest friends, and I'm like chuckling because that's like not him. It's almost, this is like such a circular sentence, but he's really a very thoughtful guy. He's a great doctor. And I just think like sentences like this don't do him justice. I shadowed pediatrics so that I could learn about pediatrics. It's just like, what are we doing here? You know, I now have a better understanding of how our healthcare system operates, including what successfully running a private practice entails. Like this is such a broad sentence, right? I have a better understanding of healthcare, and I know how a private practice is run. It's such a broad thing. There's insurance, there's administration, there's hiring, there's malpractice. There's so many things, right? But like, what are we talking about here? You shadowed a pediatrician. That's pretty much it, right? Learning from these consummate professionals, like you're starting to see these like words are creeping up again, right? What does consummate mean again? I've gained a deeper appreciation for the work primary care physicians do. I especially admire the lasting relationships they form with their patients. In fact, like this is probably the sentence I'm most interested in. And if I were reading my friend Jeff's application with him as he's writing, I would say, Jeff, there's something interesting here. Dive into this. Tell me a story. Because I would rather read about this than this or this, right? I don't need to read these sentences. I don't need to read about consummate professionals, but I do need to read about lasting relationships and physicians and patients, right? Again, writing is a team sport, and the consequence of not writing well is that you don't really put your best foot forward, and who you are on paper is not a good representation of who you are as a person. I think that's a shame. All right, moving on here, we have a dance marathon. Having attended these events in the past, I wanted to continue this tradition in college. I fundraised for and participated in Dance Marathon, which is hosted by the American Cancer Society. On each occasion, I danced and I walked with friends and strangers and was inspired by the testaments of survivors and their loved ones. Through these experiences, I learned that you can lend your support to noble causes through straightforward means. Awesome, right? I love how simple this is. I danced and I walked, and I can support real people and real causes just by doing simple things. I really like this reflection because it's really well substantiated by the story prior, and it's not like you're not going for the home run. This is a simple conclusion and it's well supported. I'd rather have a simple conclusion that is well supported than a huge home run conclusion that is poorly supported. I learned that I believe that it is a social responsibility to raise awareness for and get involved in the movements that widely impact our communities. Again, I love it. Simple. This was a small experience that took 24 hours a year, and he does a good job of representing why it's important and why he cares about it. I would rather read much more of those because they leave a good taste in my mouth, and I like continue to read the future experiences with that positive bias for you, as opposed to reading kind of the other experiences where I'm like, that's not really making me have the best perspective of you. Okay, next, we have a hospital volunteer position. I volunteered in 4 different departments. Again, if you were a hospital volunteer, I imagine you did. Surgical, OBS, ICU, PEDS. I transported patients, I attended to their needs, I assisted hospital staff with various errands. Again, this is just a responsibility sentence that we're really just wasting characters writing this. Like, it's not necessary because I don't learn anything more, right? I know what you do. I know that you transport patients and clean the desk and pick up the phone and pick up supplies from the basement. I know that already. Everyone who reads this knows that. Through spending intimate time with patients and helping them with basic everyday tasks, I was humbled by the opportunity to help people by way of such simple actions. I love this, right? It would have been stronger if you said, you know, what I did was I took a wet wipe, and for one of the patients, Steve, who had severe cerebral palsy and couldn't clean for himself, me and the nursing staff cleaned Steve. right? And it was humbling to recognize that I could do something for other people that I felt was so simple that I do for myself every day that they could not do for themselves, right? I was humbled by the opportunity to help people by way of such simple actions. And now this is giving me like a more positive perspective on this student, this pre-med. Observing medical practitioners collectively operate as a team showed me that comprehensive patient care is a collective effort. Redundant, right? Collectively operate, patient care is a collective effort that requires precise communication and coordination. Okay, fine. I've since become increasingly adept at handling patients. What does that really mean, right? You're good at talking to them, you're good at anticipating their needs, what is it? And I'm more mindful about conducting myself in a professional manner. Again, like, what does that mean? Were you not professional in the beginning? Were you now addressing people as doctor and by name? I don't really get the point of that, right? So, let's continue. Ironically, I gained the most meaningful insights from the more uneventful shifts merely accompanying patients. Okay. Rather than the busier ones observing procedures and assisting doctors. I mean, I like this, right? I like how simple this is, and it gives me a different way of thinking about something. Most pre-meds would think, oh, I learn the most when I see a lumbar tap and when I'm helping a doctor with a skin biopsy. But he's saying, actually, I didn't really learn that much there. I learned more from the stuff that was, the shifts that were uneventful. And I was just with my patients, right? Walking into a room, let's see if he gives us an example, because that's what I'm really looking for here. Walking into a room, I could expect to meet someone with an entirely different personality and temperament from the last, okay? Maybe he gives me an example. Thus, I work to improve my bedside manner and adapt my mannerisms according to help patients feel more comfortable and relaxed. And I don't know, I think the balloon has popped now. We kind of lost the momentum that we built with these two sentences. I really wish there was a example there. Worked with children in the PICU and the pediatrics, gave me similar resolve. I found that while some kids preferred coddling, great, others were more independent and cherished their autonomy. Great, right? These are great specifics about how kids are different. This required me to properly read a room and notice intricate details like body language to determine how to best approach and aid each person. It's a little too abstract, too general for me. And I just wish that he focused on one patient story. All right. I believe this kind of perceptive acuity is an overlooked skill that has personally helped me better establish rapport with people. I've concluded that disciplined and passionate care providers can drastically improve patients' mood and outlooks. This was evident in how patients and their families rarely failed to express their gratitude for my assistance. Yeah, I don't know. Now we're back to feeling self-referential, right? It's like that families rarely fail to express their gratitude. They thanked you every single time. Like, not only if it were true, even if it were true, it's not really necessary to share, right? It's not necessary to share that families thanked you every single time you were on shift. Being the recipient of such appreciation has taught me the power of presence and how making oneself readily available to help in any given capacity has its own therapeutic properties. Yeah. So a couple comments, right? The self-referential part about like families rarely failing to express their gratitude, I think that's a huge miss. You don't want to come across as the guy who thinks that everyone is thankful for him. It's a bit of an odd perception. And there's no real example of that. And then at the end, we get this abstract conclusion about how if you make yourself ready to help, that's therapeutic for you. It's just everything is kind of overcomplicated. It's abstract. There's no example. There's not a single patient that is described. There's some kids that provide coddling and then some that are more independent. And I thought we were really moving in the right direction there, but we never ended up getting a real kind of example. And as a result, you write these like reflective, almost like poetic waxing type writing. And it just doesn't tell you anything. As a reader, you can see like my head is kind of hurting. I'm just like re-digesting what was written and I still don't understand it. And it's just a little bit too complicated for me. right? And if it's too complicated, what happens is I just skip it and move on to the next thing, which you do not want. All right, so let's move on to the next one. Meals. I think it's just like a meal delivery for elderly working activity here. So I volunteered at this company to translate the teachings from a geriatrics class, like immediately. You and I, the viewer, if you've gotten to this point, you and I have read through his entire application thus far, right? At what point does he talk about geriatrics class? Like, this is so, there's no context here. So translate the teachings, like what teachings, what geriatrics class, into productive action in the real world. So I was paired with a seasoned driver. Yeah, like the word choice, it almost feels like they're writing this way because the addition of fancy words makes them feel better, right? But why do I need to know that this driver is seasoned? Like, does it mean that the driver has had his driver's license for 5 years, or that the driver has driven for this company for 30 years? Even if both of those interpretations, one of them is true, is like, what's the point? What info does this add? So you have to be disciplined. With every single word, you only have 700 characters, right? So every single word has to have a purpose. Like, this has no purpose. Drive for their Meals on Wheels program. So we prepared and transported meals to immobile residents across Los Angeles. Okay, remember, writing is a team sport. If I were supporting Jeff here, I would say, tell me please about one of the immobile residents that you supported. What's their story? How has this helped, etc. Let's see if I get that. These deliveries had important consequences as they served as a sole food source for many elderly clients. Cool, let's hear about one. After we finished our route, I had the chance to coordinate activities such as mobility with seniors back at the center. Okay, so we're not going to hear about it. We're now hearing about a different thing, mobility exercises. This experience has made me more conscious of the growing elderly demographic and the corresponding need for senior facilities and services around outside the scope of healthcare. Okay, then we get this just like reflection about senior health. This is why the 20-40-40 RIR framework exists, guys. It's because we need the stories, we need the data so that we have something to remember and hold on to. And without it, you can see how these extracurriculars are just like flat. They're just flat. And you want to just move on. And you don't remember any part of it, right? Like, we need to enrich these extracurriculars with stories. Please remember that. Okay, let's move on here to the next one. We have a tutoring position and a lot of notes here. So Blink is a student-run organization dedicated to addressing youth illiteracy through tutoring and mentorship. Great. I had the pleasure of tutoring several remarkable grade school children from various underserved communities in reading, writing, math, and other curriculum. Beyond improving my etiquette with children, working with this demographic has made me cognizant of the socioeconomic inequalities that continue to persist in society, a cycle that seems to partly stem from an imperfect education system. It's just too much, guys. It's really just too much, right? It's too much. Look, I write all these imprecise phrases. People, and I want to make this clear, right? Premeds write this way because the work that is required to simplify their writing is too much. It's too much work for them. And so let me kind of draw this out for you guys. So I can draw with this little thing here, but imagine like you got this bell curve, right? Or let me go to someplace. Let me just start. All right, so let me draw this concept out for you guys. So let's say you have this like bell curve, right? And your thoughts start as simple. I'll just write simple. And then in order to like process the kind of the concept and add more to it, then it becomes like complicated and your simple writing goes up, right? So the thing is, in order to go back to simple, it also takes more work, right? To go from complicated back to simple here. So if you have like this bar graph, on the y-axis here is like how complicated it is. And then on the x-axis is like how much effort it takes. Or sorry. Let's flip this. Let me repeat that. So if you have this bar graph, right? On the x-axis, it's like it's effort. Yeah. So you have this bar graph, right? So on the x-axis is effort, right? If you move to the right, it takes more effort. And then on the y-axis is how simple or complicated it is, right? So in order to go from simple back to simple, it takes a lot of effort, a ton of effort. And a lot of pre-meds, they get stuck here in this like complicated piece. They don't want to put in that extra work to re-simplify the sentence. And what happens is you get these experiences that are just so complicated. And okay. And again, with that concept in mind, let's go back to this, right? Just look at this. I had the pleasure of tutoring. You don't need to write that. You could just say, I tutored, right? Several remarkable. Again, don't need to have, you can put, I tutored 12 grade school kids. Simple. Or I tutored 12 kids. 4 words, very simple. From various underserved communities in reading, writing, math, and other curriculum. I mean, at this point, just put reading, writing, math, history, art, statistics, just like all of that, right? It's not necessary to have these subjects. Beyond improving my etiquette with children, why is that phrase important? It just like you want to make the point that you now work better with children. It's just not important for this experience, right? And so the reason I harp on this, again, is that I want you, the viewer, to really make sure that what you are putting on paper is a good representation of who you are as a pre-med, right? Who you are as a person. When you get stuck in the high vocabulary and the words that aren't readable, it's very difficult to really understand who you are, because all of our brain power is dedicated to deciphering the complicated phrases you're putting on the page, the phrases that don't mean anything, right? And this is just like the crown jewel. Cognizant of the socioeconomic inequalities that persist in society, a cycle that seems to partly stem from an imperfect education system. Well, gosh, it's just a lot, right? It's a huge concept. And it's a big reflection. I just would love it if there were more elaboration here. Just an example or how that sentence is related to one of the kids that you worked with, right? You talk about how youth literacy is a big pressing issue, but how pressing is it? I don't know. Like, are 20% of kids illiterate? Are 2% of kids illiterate? Are most of middle America illiterate? Like, it is your job as a writer to tell the reader why what you're doing is important. And I don't think this does a good job of doing that. Okay. All right, great. Let's move on to this hobby of weightlifting. A couple of things I want to highlight here. I love some of these reflections, right? Not all of us are weightlifters. I'm certainly not. And this is one of my buddies. He's an elite weightlifter, winning kind of like awards in powerlifting competitions and things like that. So he's like very well qualified to really share what the sport is like. I found that unlike other sports, I was the only one holding myself accountable. And when faced with whatever pressures life threw at me, I could expect to find lucidity after an intense workout. And I think it's interesting. I personally, if I were writing with him, again, writing is a team sport, if I were writing with him, I would have told him, like, these are interesting things, dude. Like, try and expand here. Tell me more about this. Show me an example. Lean into that concept, because there's something interesting there that the reader will inevitably want to know more about. Okay. And then next we have this office assistant here. The big things I want to highlight is he's managing packaging and transporting shipments in the warehouse. Then he does some data entry and paperwork. And the tasks and deadlines I was delegated demanded effective organizational and time management skills. Okay, I learned from working a 9-to-5 what the value of $1 was, and I can confidently say that I now exercise better judgment when it comes to personal finances. Okay, like, I just think it's a little bit of a stretch, because you were working on a data entry position and working with paperwork, and it's not like you were working on this big research publication that needed to be done because the grant would expire, right? So just like the sentence seems a little bit overblown, and there's a little bit of a reach there, as opposed to what the conclusion sounds like you're running a multi-million-dollar business, but that's not really what the case is, right? So remember, we had the experience with the dance marathon where the conclusion was very fitting. And here, this is the opposite problem, where you overextend it to sound impressive. And I'd rather you just tell things as they are, as opposed to stretch the truth. It just looks kind of poorly. All right, moving on, we got this Eagle Scout position. He had this large-scale community service project in which he planned and oversaw the restoration of several vehicles at the American Society of Military History Museum. And again, this is the first time we're like really seeing a real example, and I think it's very cool. I think it's very cool to restore old vehicles at a museum. And I only appreciate that because you told me a real example. And now that you say that most meaningful achievements are never accomplished overnight, which every premed can say, right? I believe you a little bit more because you show me this real example of how you restored these cars at the museum. And so what you are saying, the invaluable memories, the lessons and experiences that you've gained are contribute to the individual you are today. It lands a little better. It's not perfect, right? I would love to learn exactly what memories, exactly what lessons, exactly what experiences. But because you have, like, for the first time, a real specific example, the conclusion hits a little bit better. So the takeaway is throw the story, throw the specific, throw the data in there. Wow. So those were the working activities. There's a ton to learn there, a ton. And now let's take a little break and walk into now the personal statement. I don't know how, the little girl said, her voice thick with apprehension. Sure you do. Put the inhaler to your mouth, press the button on top, and inhale for as deep as you can. Hold it for 5 seconds, said Dr. Chan as he demonstrated once again. I couldn't explain it, but from a technical standpoint, this was hardly the most intriguing diagnosis I had observed. All right. But something about the circumstances of this particular exam piqued my interest. Okay. So, I think there's just something about this sentence. Again, it may be the biases from the previous experiences, but from a technical standpoint, this was hardly the most intriguing diagnosis I'd observed. Like, just remember, this is a pre-med who's applying to medical school. It's not like a 6th year pulmonology and critical care fellow. This is a pre-med, right? First of all, like, all diagnoses should be interesting to you because you're not in medical school quite yet. And I don't know. Even if it's not interesting, it's just not a good look to not call it, kind of hardly the most interesting diagnosis, as if you had been practicing medicine for 20 or 30 years. Again, there's just something about the framing there that isn't right and doesn't paint you in the right way. And again, this is like one of my buddies, and I know that he doesn't want to come across this way. And I think, unfortunately, his writing makes him come across this way. But something about the circumstances of this particular exam piqued my interest. Here, I'd rather you just tell me what piqued your interest as opposed to just like setting the stage. We used this whole paragraph to like set the stage, and I think it could have been cut down to maybe 1 or 2 sentences. Moments ago, Dr. Chan had detailed the pathology of asthma and stressed the implications this would have moving forward. Still, the child remained adamant about not using the inhaler. But why? None of my friends have to, she insisted. I suspected that we had uncovered the underlying reasons behind her objection: fear and humiliation. A couple of really awesome things, right? So one is the quotes are really good. The quotes are really good, especially this one. But why? None of my friends have to. It's an interesting concept for a little kid who doesn't want to be different, right? Most kids want to fit in and they want to be with their friends. And this quote really captures that message. So again, I love stories. I love putting the quotes in there. And I think this is a great example of how a quote in a story will increase how compelling your writing is. So we go to next here. The other concept I have is that there's a lot of simple writing about a kid who wants to fit in. There's also just like we're throwing these huge words in there. The pathology of asthma and the implications and remaining adamant and suspecting that we had uncovered the underlying reasons behind her objection. It's just like, it's so complicated for no reason, in my opinion. Just keep it simple, keep it simple, keep it readable. I noticed this to be a common occurrence in the clinic. That emotion often clouded one's judgment. Dr. Chan smiled, for he had handled similar situations before. Well, dear, you have sensitive lungs. This inhaler has medications that helps you breathe easier. With this, you can play with your friends for as long as you want. Again, I just love this quote, right? It's like, you can see a doctor talk to a little kid that says, you can play with your kids, you can play with your friends. I know you get tired when you're running around playing tag, but when you use this medication, you can play with your friends. These sincere words had a calming effect that prompted the girl to reconsider her initial stance and come to trust his counsel. This is a little girl who wants to play on the playground. She is not reconsidering her initial stance, and she is not trusting anyone's counsel, right? It's just, I don't know why we have to juxtapose with these like really complicated words. Just simplify the words. While walking the family back to the lobby, I realized that my curious fascination with this case stemmed from the remarkable parallels I noticed between the doctor-patient interaction and my own experiences in pedagogy and mentorship. Okay, kind of a big jump there, right? We went from a kid with asthma and the beautiful rapport that a physician built with his young patient, and then we jumped straight to pedagogy and mentorship. So let's see where this goes, but I already kind of feel like it's a big jump. Yeah, so highlighted in red are just all these really difficult phrases that just I don't think belong, because it, first of all, it describes a young girl who's not reconsidering her initial stance and trusting counsel, but also just like mixes these like big fancy words when you don't need them. As a learning assistant for life sciences courses, I formulated each lesson plan with a goal that each student would leave more confident and enlightened. Okay. As a camp counselor, I did my best impression of a TED Talk speaker. And this is a phrase where I'm not sure why it's here, right? What exactly do you want the reader to pull from this? That you're on a stage and have PowerPoint presentation behind you, or that you're a motivational speaker. I was hoping to rally them to pursue a post-secondary education. Again, I know this guy, and most people that I talk to would never call it a post-secondary education. As a personal mentor to struggling second grader Angel, I made it my utmost priority to ensure that he improved his literacy skills every week. So he says it's his utmost priority, right? So is he going to talk about the sacrifices in his schedule? Why? How is he going to make this a priority? I never foresaw that these non-clinical ventures would play such an influential role in molding my perspective and definition of medicine. So we're just continuing to like flit back and forth between clinical medicine and then teaching. And it's like, I don't really get how he worked with Angel, and I also don't really get how that's related to medicine. These endeavors have led me to ascertain that the role of a physician overlaps considerably with that of an educator. So he's going to draw the parallel for me. Both professions require comprehensive knowledge in their fields and the aptitude to effectively convey this information based on the personalized needs of their clients. It's just so complicated, right? And the argument actually doesn't make sense because barbers also overlap with surgeons, but just because they're similar doesn't answer the question. Remember, the question is use the space below to explain why you want to go to medical school, right? And just because two things are similar doesn't mean that barbers now want to be surgeons and surgeons want to be barbers. Indeed, I saw that the process in which I diagrammed concepts, shared advice, and offered assistance to students had much in common with the meticulous and methodical approach physicians employ when assessing patients. This is easily like a 15th grade level sentence. Meticulous, methodical, employ, assessing, diagram. It's just like, okay, fine. I beat the dead horse, sorry. However, the two professions diverge in a crucial aspect, okay? So here's where they're different. Doctors help people at their most helpless and susceptible states, okay? So educators don't do that, that's fine. They function as preemptive safety nets, catching people when their health slips and enabling them to return to their everyday lives. It was this fundamental difference that ultimately made me gravitate towards a career in medicine over academia. So if you were reading this personal statement along with me, have you gotten the sense that he wanted to go to academia? Like, he had 1 or 2 experiences with the bacteriophage research. Did you get a sense that he wanted to be a researcher? And in this personal statement, did that give you that perspective? Because it didn't for me. It didn't really make me think that he wanted to be a high school teacher or a college teacher or a PI at a college campus. So when he says, oh, now I don't want to do academia anymore, I want to do medicine, it doesn't really make sense to me. And the other comment I had was, when you're catching people when their health slips and enables them to return to their everyday lives, it's like magical. And medicine's not quite like that. You don't just catch people when their health slips. It's like a lifetime of battling disease, or people get sick acutely and then you can try and treat them in their hospital stay and send them home. But for the most part, like, medicine is a lifetime pursuit. It's not I caught you, now you're sick, and now I fix you completely, right? It's not really like that. I can vividly recall the atmosphere in that exam room. Between us, I could extend the girl my tacit sympathies. Like, again, no one says this. And her parents could provide their comforting embrace. In the end, only Dr. Chan had the training and expertise to deliver her a definitive solution. Dr. Chan delivered this girl a definitive solution. And just as importantly, reassurance that everything was going to be okay. Yeah, to me, this also just doesn't make sense, right? You are saying that your tacit sympathies was all that you could do. But in the end, only Dr. Chan could give her the definitive solution. And then you go back to saying, but just as important as the definitive solution is the reassurance that everything was going to be okay, which is what you gave. You gave the tacit sympathies. But that logic also doesn't make sense and confuses the reader. I could relate to the gratification that comes from helping people understand and make sense of things. But having the ability to guide others through their most physically and emotionally vulnerable moments, that was a wholly unfamiliar sensation. Yeah, so this is the first time where I'm just like, okay, fantastic, thank you. It's like, it's humble, it's like you don't know everything and you are appreciating what others are showing you and teaching you. It's just this peer observant reflection that I just really like. You don't have to be the hero of the story. And I think this is one of the first times you really show me that, right? So as I continue to observe paradigms of this personal revelation as a volunteer, I strove to improve myself in aspects that would allow me to better comprehend this delicate process. Okay, complicated paradigms, personal revelation, delicate process. Thus, I focused on forming genuine relationships with the patients that I attended to. Although I lacked the means to fully alleviate each individual's physical suffering, I found that I could still uplift their spirits through simple acts of kindness. It amazes me that a virtual stranger can foster happiness merely by sharing a heartfelt conversation. Okay, I like it, right? You are saying that you don't have the ability to prescribe medications or do surgery, but you can still help people. And you feel like that is meaningful to you. And I just appreciate how simple that is. Through these events, I came to appreciate the transformative power of human empathy, the resilience of the human spirit. I reflect on the impact I made in this role, imbued a unique satisfaction that was incomparable to my other experiences. Okay, this is another thing where it's like, okay, you're saying that this is the most satisfying thing in your life, but you don't really show me how. There's no real proof, right? You're just telling me that this is the best thing in your life. And it's hard to believe. It's hard to believe at this stage. It's a great reflection, but I just don't think that there's a real set of stories that really support that. Let's wrap up this conclusion here. The art of medicine is intertwined with the practice of medicine. An effective physician is a versatile teacher, one who ensures that patients are fully informed about their conditions and have a thorough understanding of their potential treatment options. Of course, I'm not so naive as to suggest that every affliction or complication can be cured through sheer optimism. Okay, awesome. Being around bedridden patients with all varieties of debilitating prognoses has shown me that harsh reality. At the same time, I'm also grateful that this has allowed me to attest to the solace a doctor's presence can provide, to affirm that one is capable of instilling hope and a sense of direction during life's darkest hours. It feels like I'm at the outro of a Batman movie, a sense of direction during life's darkest hours. I envision a career in medicine in which I can incorporate my various passions. Is that just teaching? By empowering people to overcome their health adversities through both an inclusive education and a supportive handhold. Okay. So in the end, right, we have some good reflections like this, that not everything can be cured just through optimism, but there's just like zero story. There's no story about a patient who couldn't be cured with sheer optimism. There's a story of a little kid who has asthma, right? Who is cured actually by just optimism and an inhaler. And then there's all this stuff about direction during life's darkest hours. The kid didn't really seem like she was in her darkest hours. I felt like that was a little bit too much. So the conclusion overall just like doesn't really match the personal statement. And overall, the argument is that this person wants to be a doctor because they were a teacher. And as a teacher and medicine overlap, they realize that medicine is like teaching plus the fulfillment of helping people during their darkest times. And I don't think that the resume that we have read together and like spent an hour and a half digesting together really supports that conclusion, right? So it's an okay personal statement. It's not good, it's not great. It's an okay personal statement for all of these reasons. All right. So let's move on to the conclusions here. The first one here is that there's a lot of the right message, but the wrong messenger. So let's move on to the conclusions here. The first one is that there's the right message, but just the wrong messenger. I think there's a lot of conclusions and reflections that aren't substantiated. They don't really have the stories that you need. They don't have the lived experiences or the data. And because of that, it just sounds like they're a little bit out of touch with reality. Right message, right conclusions. So don't worry about the conclusions or the reflections, but focus on the evidence before the fact, right? The story before the conclusion. Number 2, readability. Simple works and fancy hurts. If you write simply, I promise you, it will work. If we're focusing on what the word means, assuage, post-secondary education, like these just light during the world's darkest hours, we're just losing the bigger picture. The message is important, not the vocabulary. And remember that it's hard to simplify things. Simple is on the other side of complicated, right? You want to make your simple sentences, give it a little bit of juice, give it a little nuance and description, but that makes it complicated. And then you have to edit it back down so that it's simple, it's clear, it's precise. That is how you get fantastic writing. Don't stop at the stage of complexity. The core lesson or core takeaway number 3 is that writing is a team sport. There are places to expand that are fantastic. Jeff here did not expand. I would have wanted to know more about the weightlifting and the personal accountability. I would have wanted to know more about XYZ, but I didn't get the story, right? And there were many places where there were irrelevant details, like, oh, I volunteered in the PICU and the surgery and the medical and the OBS unit. Like, I already know that. I already know what you do as a teaching assistant. I don't need to know that you make lesson plans. So all that fluff that you kept in, I didn't need to know that. It bored me. It had me kind of have a little bit of a bad perspective on some of the writing. And so writers will have a blind side to your own writing because you're the one writing it, right? You experience it. This is your lived life. And you are blind to some of the places that can be really interesting or that can be really boring. And so you need writing to be a team sport. You have to have someone else tell you exactly where it's exciting or exactly where it falls short. So partner up with a buddy. Number 4, self-referential hurts. Don't come across as like haughty or boastful or that you're above medicine. You are a pre-med applying to medical school. You cannot come across as self-referential. That will drastically hurt your chances. No one wants to work with the self-referential guy when it's 3 a.m. and you need help with your ultrasound IV. It's a 2-person job, and the only person is the person that's just like full of themselves. You don't want to ask that person for help. You don't want to be on call with that person. You want the person who's humble and who's willing to put in the work and who will help you no matter what. Self-referential hurts, humility helps. Medical school will teach you medicine, so don't feel the need to be above a asthma diagnosis, right? You should be able to understand and highlight humility and respect and equality with others. Those are the core traits that medical schools cannot teach you. You have to go into medicine with those things. And last is, does this shoe fit? 10,000 foot view of the student experiences and their curated explanation. Let's see, let's just move this. So number 5 is, does this shoe fit? You want to have a 10,000 foot view of the student's experiences after we read all 15 working activities. And then you read the personal statement, you ask them, oh, does why they want to go to medicine make sense based on their resume, right? Do you believe it, and does it make sense? And I think this resume doesn't really match that personal statement. Those are the 5 takeaways. This was an entire breakdown of a 3.85 GPA, 514 MCAT students, great stats, graduated from UCLA, published in Nature, but really did struggle to do well in medical school admissions. And after this thorough breakdown, I'm hoping you see kind of why he had some trouble. There were issues with his writing that could have been really, really cleaned up and would have painted a much better picture of him throughout the application cycle. Ultimately, my buddy Jeff goes and is accepted to Virginia Commonwealth University Medical School, where he graduated, and he's now a fantastic doctor, fantastic anesthesiology resident. We're still quite close, and it's just a shame because I do think that this application did not capture how awesome he is as a person and his body of work as an undergrad. Hopefully this helped you learn a lot about what writing is like in the application process and how to make sure you're not making the same mistakes that Jeff does, and what Jeff is doing well that you can copy and emulate in your own application. If you have stats like the 3.85, the 514 MCAT, you can get into medical school. You can get into great medical schools. But you need to make sure that writing application is strong. Hopefully this helped. Thank you, Jeff, for your willingness to share your story, and see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.